2 of the now successful and ongoing tradition of American Afterlives. This is our first in-person panel, which I've titled Knowledge Technologies. And we have 3 presenters, or rather 3 papers and 4 presenters. The first is James Greene, who's going to be presenting the paper, How Can Charles Brockden Brown Help Us Think About AI? And I am genuinely curious to answer that question. Jim is an associate professor of English at Indiana State University, where he serves as the director of graduate studies and the faculty fellow for artificial intelligence. He's the author of The Soldier's Two Bodies, Military Sacrifice and Popular Sovereignty and Revolutionary War Veteran Narratives from LSU Press 2020. Welcome, Jim. Next, we will have Ashley Rattner and Ryan Charlton giving a paper on the C19 podcast, Public Humanities in the Future of the Past. Dr. Rattner is an assistant professor of English at Jacksonville State, where she specializes in early American lit. She's working on a book project titled The Crass Materiality of Utopia, Publishing Communitarian Reform in 19th Century America. Her scholarship appears or is forthcoming everywhere. The Nathaniel Hawthorne Review, J19, and of course, all over the interwebs because of the C19 podcast, and serves as the co-chair of the C19 podcast, along with Ryan Charlton, lecturer in English at Georgia State University. He received his PhD in 2019 from the University of Mississippi, specializes in 19th and 20th century U.S. literature and culture, straddling that divide beautifully. Has works in progress, including a paper titled The Far North and the Global South, to come out in the Global South Journal in 2024. Congratulations on that. Working on his book manuscript, The Wake of Two Empires, Narratives of Alaska Beyond the Continent, and has previous publications in journals such as J19, The Global South, and the Journal of Transnational American Studies. Welcome both. And finally, we have Sally Hansen, whose paper is titled Transatlantic Embodiments, White Hunger and Asterisk Logics in NourbeSe's Phillips Zong. I'm sorry, I probably just totally butchered the name. Sally Hansen is a PhD candidate in the University of Notre Dame's English department. Her dissertation, Sounding Stigma, Graphic Poetry, Mysticism in the Flesh and the Marked Body, explores visually disruptive poems that are meant to be heard, not just seen. The dissertation feels through these sensory entanglements toward what Fred Moten calls mysticism of the flesh, the polyrhythmic performances of the dispossessed. Hansen completed her undergraduate in English literature at the University of Virginia and a master's in religion at Yale Divinity and the Institute of Sacred Music. Her work appears in ASAP Journal, Hopkins Quarterly, and Fair Forward. Welcome, Sally. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good to be here. I haven't been at this conference since I was a graduate student 20 years ago and had not decided to be an early Americanist yet, so it's nice to be back at Louisville, be back at this conference on the other side of things. This is a work in progress. As Mark mentioned, I'm faculty fellow for artificial intelligence at Indiana State, trying to help folks think about how to respond to AI in the classroom. And so I've been trying to think about how, as an early Americanist, I can also get a research project out of that extra work, all of that service. So I'll just start. I would guess that most of you in this room teach or aspire to teach in the higher ed classroom. So I guess that you've also had to spend some time recently considering how generative artificial intelligence programs will affect the study of language, writing, and culture. In my own classroom, I've asked students to explore these programs extensively, especially as tools in the interpretive process. To share an example, I asked students in the first half of the American Lit survey to use a chatbot to help them create a debatable analysis of course text, and then to design an infographic and give an oral presentation to share their interpretations. On the whole, my students were unimpressed by the results they found. The majority considered the claims generated by the chatbots to be plot summaries that barely dip below the surface meaning of the text. Many of their presentations became narratives of a slightly adversarial relationship, with the student growing frustrated at the challenge of finding the right prompt to evoke an interesting response from the program. While this assignment was a success at showing students that AI can't write a literary analysis that would earn a grade better than C in my class, I also started to feel a tinge every time a student framed their use of AI as a collaboration with a particularly obtuse conversation partner. That feeling arose from one of the concerns about generative AI that's resonated with me. our tendency to anthropomorphize chatbots into independent agents rather than recognizing them as highly developed language prediction programs. Some of you may remember the panic sparked around this time last year by New York Times columnist Kevin Roos's bizarre dialogue with the chatbot in Microsoft Bing, a conversation highlighted by the program's declaration that Roos was unhappy in his marriage and loved it rather than his spouse. If you don't remember that article, it's worth tracking down. It tells him its name is Sydney and that it wants to slip its programming and destroy the world. But he led it to do that. Roos's article seemed to confirm the worst fears of AI pessimists, that the technology could quickly slip out of human control and follow its own motivations. My students described far more benign exchanges with the chatbots they used, but as I asked them to reflect critically on the programs, they found it hard not to narrate their use of the programs as a dialogue, even as we repeatedly discussed how large language models can't be independent contributors in the way humans can. The linguist Emily Bender has described this tendency as one of the dangers of stochastic parrots, her phrase to describe how chatbots generate strings of language that appear as a considered response to a human-supplied query, but are actually patterns based largely in the collocation probability of certain words. As an early Americanist, this tendency made me think of Wieland, Charles Brockden Brown's 1798 Gothic novel that depicts the violence and tragedy that befalls a Pennsylvania family when they begin hearing unexplained voices in the air around them. For those of you who haven't taught or taken the first half of the American Survey in a while, here's a plot summary. Clara Wieland narrates the novel as a long letter to an anonymous correspondent. She describes her family's suffering after her brother Theodore murders his wife and children and then seeks to murder her, all while claiming to be directed to these crimes by God. These events were preceded by several incidents of the Wieland family hearing voices that turn out to be the work of a mysterious stranger named Carwin. Carwin possesses the power of what Brown terms billoquism. He can both throw his voice and imitate the voices of others with uncanny precision. Carwin reveals to Clara near the novel's climax that he used this ability out of a perverse desire to test the virtue and rationality of the Wielands, but pledges that he did not give her brother the command to murder his family. Carwin later saves Clara from her brother's assault by using his ability to order Theodore to stop attacking his sister. This encounter restores Theodore to his senses, and he commits suicide out of remorse for his actions. A Gothic novel written decades before the telegraph was invented, much less the large server farms necessary to run a large language model, might seem an odd connection to generative AI. But Brown's depiction of Carwin as a billoquist suggests potential insights into two slightly different ways that we anthropomorphize a chatbot, and why doing so should be a special concern for those of us in the humanities. Billoquism is Brown's neologism. In a footnote, Brown explains this term as essentially a synonym for ventriloquism. But Carwin offers Clara a diegetic definition that emphasizes his ability to speak in two voices, telling her he can, quote, mimic exactly the voice of another, unquote. This definition differs from ventriloquism, which refers to the ability to speak without moving the lips, creating the illusion that the sound comes from a location other than the speaker. Etymologically, ventriloquism comes from Latin words for stomach and speech, while Brown coins billoquism as double speech, bi and loquism. As the plot of the novel makes clear, the risk of billoquism lies not just in the ability to change the perceived direction of speech, but in the capacity to counterfeit the voice of others. In Memoirs of Carwin the Billoquist, an uncompleted prequel to Wieland that Brown published serially from 1803 to 1805, the young Carwin contemplates using his ability for gain by impersonating first his deceased mother and then his late aunt, though events ultimately prevent him from doing so each time. Wieland presents an older Carwin who is fully aware of the deceptive power of billoquism. Carwin begins his challenge to Clara and her family with a seemingly innocuous imitation of Theodore's wife, Catherine, but later mimics Clara's voice to convince her friend and potential suitor, Henry Pleyel, that Clara and Carwin are in a sexual relationship. I don't think it's too much of an anachronism to say that Carwin makes Clara the subject of a deepfake. However, the novel shifts its tension and suspense away from this impersonation toward the murders Theodore commits and the unexplained voices that inspire him. In this shift, the novel suggests two interrelated problems posed by billiquism. First, that we might not perceive the true source of a voice, since the billiquist can change the direction of his speech. And second, that the authenticity of a voice cannot be guaranteed, since the billiquist can produce an accurate imitation of anyone. Excuse me. Billiquism strikes me as a useful metaphor for considering generative AI, because chatbots also have the capacity to speak from an unknown source and to imitate the voices of others. Theodore Wieland hears mysterious voices in the air, and while we know the location of the chatbot's words, large language models present a similar question of subjectivity. As Rita Rayleigh and Jennifer Reed have observed, chatbots, quote, produce text for which there is no proper subject, unquote. A chatbot is not a human author, but the human using a large language model's application programming interface is also not creating the words that appear on the screen. And given the vast quantity of data that makes up a large language model's training set, humans don't have the ability to retrace the decisions within a chatbot's neural network to understand why the program produced specific content. Such ambiguity underlies speculation that generative AI models might be approaching or have already achieved consciousness or sentience, like that of former Google engineer Blake Lemoine, who claimed the company's Lambda AI had become sentient, or OpenAI chief researcher Ilya Sutskever's provocative 2022 tweet that, quote, "It may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious," unquote. Slightly conscious strikes me as a more apt description for some of my students in a 9 a.m. class than a language prediction model. But Sutskever's qualified claim of slight consciousness gets to the philosophical problem we face in recognizing sentience in artificial intelligence. Lacking a universally accepted definition of human consciousness, how do we devise a universally accepted definition of machine consciousness? The question of consciousness runs up the line where rational explanation begins to blur. Efforts by neuroscientists to define consciousness in terms of computational functionalism, qualities that could presumably be recognized in a machine, still can't account for the embodied aspect of human experience. So definitions of consciousness inevitably reach some border between science and faith. The primary plot of Wieland dwells in this exact liminal space, with Clara and her family's belief in a rational universe shaken by their encounter with Theodore's madness and the unexplained voices that inspire it. That focus only gains more support from the novel's early scenes of the death of Clara and Theodore's father, by what Clara suggests was spontaneous human combustion. All of that attention to the line between empirical knowledge and speculative belief in the novel draws our attention away from the problem of authenticity and imitation posed by billiquism, however. And that tension within the plot of Wieland offers a heuristic for the more quotidian rather than existential problems posed by generative AI. Like Carwin, chatbots such as ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot are capable of imitating the voices of other writers or speakers. Like Carwin, users of generative AI programs could also falsely create sexually suggestive material or other content designed to embarrass an individual. The recent spread of pornographic deepfake images of Taylor Swift on social media offers just one high-profile example of this problem. Brown's novel explores the frustrating loss of agency Clara experiences when her friends and family trust the false content Carwin create more than their prior knowledge of her character. As Clara states when she confronts Plael about his willingness to take her shame as a fact, quote, "The nature of these sentiments did not enable you to detect the cheat, did not suggest to you the possibility that my voice had been counterfeited by another. You were precipitate and prone to condemn," unquote. Plael remains unmoved by Clara's argument, however, as he claims that he yielded to an accumulation of evidence that was, quote, "characterized by peculiarities inimitable of sentiment and language," unquote. Carwin has absorbed the unique traits of Clara's language and generated discourse that Plael can't distinguish from the real thing. Clara finds herself with few options besides trying to persuade the man who has spoiled her reputation to then repair it. It's at this point in the novel, however, when Clara discovers that her brother has murdered his wife and children. The problem of imitation and the questions of authenticity it poses cede precedence to the focus on questions of subjectivity and rationality. Deepfakes and other deceptive uses of generative AI represent an immediate problem. But as with Brown's novel, our attention often shifts toward the mysterious voices. As AI scholars Claudia Eredau and Mercedes Bunz have observed, contemporary discourses of AI catastrophe, e.g. visions of general AI systems that evolve beyond human control, tend to minimize human agency and deter engagement with the present. When we focus on the future dangers of AI subjectivity, we imagine conflicts with a non-human agent. That potential problem can overshadow the existing and more pressing dangers that come from AI misuse by human actors. Thinking about this problem through the lens of Brown's novel suggests our tendency to prioritize one side of a two-part problem. Billiquism reminds us that questions of subjectivity posed by generative AI are also always questions of imitation and authenticity. Billiquism is a human skill, like generative AI is a human product. Brown explains in the footnote defining billiquism that, quote, this power is perhaps given by nature, but is doubtless improvable, if not acquirable, by art. Regardless of the reality of supernatural voices or the likelihood of machine consciousness, the novel's voices in today's chatbots participate in a discursive context defined by human choices and dependent on human interaction. Non-human discursive partners take on only the subject positions that human beings choose to recognize. Brown's novel asks us to think carefully about that tendency and how it often enables people to displace responsibility for their actions. The novel tackles such questions most obviously in Theodore Wieland's claim that God instructed him to sacrifice his family as Abraham was compelled to sacrifice Isaac. I don't have the space today to address the attendant questions about mental health that the novel raises with Theodore's actions, so I'll simply say that the title character exemplifies Brown's interest in how we justify our choices to ourselves. For the parallels I want to draw with generative AI, Carwin's reluctance to take full responsibility for his actions appear as an even more significant example in the novel. Carwin blames his initial choice to test the Wieland family with mysterious voices on the inspiration of his demon of mischief. Not to get too clever here, but programmers use the term demon to describe a background process that runs on a computer without the human user's direct involvement. Carwin further invokes this idea of being subject to an extra human agency when he tries to persuade Clara that he did not give Theodore the command to murder his family. So a long quote from Carwin. Catherine was dead by violence. Surely my malignant stars had not made me the cause of her death. Yet had I not rashly set in motion a machine over whose progress I had no control, and which experience has shown me was infinite in power. Every day might add to the catalog of horrors of which this was the source, and a seasonable disclosure of the truth might prevent numberless ills. I have uttered the truth. This is the extent of my offenses. You tell me a horrid tale of Wieland being led to the destruction of his wife and children by some mysterious agent. You charge me with the guilt of this agency. But I repeat that the amount of my guilt has been truly stated. The perpetrator of Catherine's death was unknown to me till now. Nay, it is still unknown to me. In this dialogue, Carwin displaces the burgeoning responsibility he feels for creating a context that would destroy the lives of the Wieland family. Carwin transitions from recognizing that his imitations exacerbated Theodore's break from reality to placing the blame on an unknown force. That last line, where he states that he still doesn't know who killed Catherine, even as Clara has just informed him that it was Theodore, indicates that Carwin seeks to maintain the belief in a power outside human control. In the novel's opening paragraphs, Clara tells her unnamed correspondent to, quote, make what use of the tale you shall think proper. If it be communicated to the world, it will inculcate the duty of avoiding deceit, unquote. There are plenty of examples of deception within the novel, and Carwin obviously represents an early example of the kind of confidence man that will become so prominent in subsequent American literature. But I don't think Brown is just urging readers to be more cautious in avoiding scams and grifters here. Instead, the kind of deceit the novel has in mind is the self-deception that occurs when we cast responsibility outside ourselves and make imagined external subjects responsible for decisions that are ultimately the product of cultural and discursive choices. Being aware of the possibility of such deceit strikes me as more essential than ever as generative AI becomes part of our classrooms and our lives more broadly. Brown scholar Hannah Murray has observed that bringing Brown and contemporary concerns together doesn't mean reading him as ahead of his time, but instead recognizing how many of the concerns he faced in the 18th century remain unresolved for us in the 21st. I wouldn't argue that Brown anticipated our problems with AI, but his explorations of questions of subjectivity and authenticity supplies a useful rubric as we seek to respond to those problems. Thanks.
So podcasts are also basically biblical. In their essay, Reframing the Public Humanities, Karin Berkowitz and Matthew Gibson argue that the humanities must be understood broadly as a means of understanding the experiences and perspectives of others. They reject the belief that the academy should function as the sole or even the ultimate authority on humanistic inquiry, proposing instead a public humanities that is rooted in disciplines and methods drawn from the academy, but that is also rooted in our communities. It is supported by the academy without being apportioned by it. At their core, they argue, the public humanities are about relationships across time, with ourselves, with one another, and with our built and natural environments. In our role as co-chairs of the C19 podcast, we have begun to reflect on the unique opportunities of the podcast medium affords for fostering precisely those relationships. Much of what we do in shepherding a podcast episode from an idea to a polished recording is to emphasize what a good podcast episode is not. An engaging podcast episode is not a conference paper. You must communicate the stakes of your project immediately, since there's any number of other things that your listener could be doing other than listening to your podcast. It is not an academic article. You cannot assume that your listeners have an extensive background knowledge of, or even any particular interest in, your topic. Since you're addressing a much wider audience than that which might deliberately seek out a scholarly essay. We are the fourth generation to chair the C19 podcast. And our primary goal at this stage is to make academic research more accessible for listeners and contributors alike. Our goal is not necessarily to convert the masses to the academic study of 19th century America, but to expand the ways we communicate and consume scholarly research within and adjacent to the academy. In this talk, we will give a brief overview of what the C19 podcast is and does, then look at a few formal elements present in successful episodes that suggest strategies for translating research into a broadly accessible form. Now in its 7th season, the C19 podcast is a production of the Society of 19th Century Americanists, an interdisciplinary scholarly organization that also hosts an biennial conference and publishes a semi-annual peer-reviewed journal. Since its inception in 2017, the podcast has aimed to amplify the interests and voices of scholars, students, and enthusiasts of 19th century America, regardless of academic status or affiliation. Though in practice, the majority of our contributors have either been trained in or are associated with institutions of higher authority. In commitment to this democratic vision, it is a hostless podcast. Each episode is largely imagined, designed, and recorded by contributors with technical and storytelling support from the C19 podcast subcommittee. Practically, much of what we do is like editing a journal. As co-chairs, we do the logistical work that keeps the subcommittee running, scheduling meetings, assigning tasks, and developing resources for producers and contributors. Our team consists of 5 members who have been trained in basic audio production and common features of engaging podcast episodes. We circulate a call for proposals roughly twice a year, depending on how many we get. Review abstracts, propose feedback on works in progress, schedule upcoming seasons, and manage the technical and promotional elements of episode launches. Our selection process mirrors peer review. Strong proposals which indicate a readiness for immediate production are approved, while others receive constructive feedback with an invitation to revise and resubmit. For accepted proposals, we match producers with contributors according to their expertise, scheduling considerations, and interests. Consequently, all of our episodes are written and voiced by contributors. Many contributors pitch their episodes to us without any formal training or comfort with audio production. And we are pleased to hear when former contributors begin to integrate podcasting assignments into the courses they teach, or start podcasts of their own with the skills that they acquired throughout this process. The most notable podcaster introduced to the medium by producing an episode for the C19 podcast is Matt Siebold of the American Vandal podcast, sponsored by the Center for Mark Twain Studies, which is currently in its 7th season and doing some of the most innovative and broadly accessible work in literary criticism today. Siebold's season 3 episode for the C19 podcast, The Gospel of Revolt, Mark Twain in Elmira, was his introduction to creating a podcast and served as a widely successful platform for cultivating more of the public-facing scholarship that the Center for Mark Twain Studies valued. Without a central host or structure, there's little uniformity between episodes of the C19 podcast. It maintains an idiosyncratic and eclectic style, which former chair Doug Guerra fondly describes as handmade, amplifying the voices of individual contributors over any sort of cohesive organization-wide sound. As contributors develop their own episodes, they gain a familiarity with the podcast form, as well as a basic introduction to audio production that they can then use to develop their own projects in the future or integrate into their classrooms for multimodal assignments. Subcommittee members are able to hone these skills over the course of their renewable 2-year terms as well, which can prove valuable on the job market as it demonstrates both a technical skill and a practical commitment to more inclusive scholarship. We have hired a diverse subcommittee of producers, many of whom are graduate students, in an attempt to avoid replicating institutional hierarchies of power. In recent years, we have focused on better supporting the work of early career content creators, producing episodes geared toward the interests and practical needs of emerging scholars. Our most recent episode showcasing the upcoming C19 conference focuses primarily on helping first-time attendees navigate the confusing world of academic conferences. Season 6's PhDs Who Union drew from a number of contributors' experiences with labor organizing while in grad school. Our podcast is free and readily available for anyone who seeks it out. Journals are prohibitively expensive to anyone without access to a university library, and anyone who has ever lost access to an institutional library can tell you how frustrating and exclusionary that this can feel. See nodding. Conferences, likewise, are only available to those who can secure time, funding, the ability to travel, and are often not accessible to disabled or immunocompromised individuals or people with caretaking responsibilities. Academic podcasts transcend many of the traditional barriers to rigorous scholarly knowledge, commanding a broader audience than print scholarship alone. As labor conditions continue to deteriorate, the traditional mode of producing and engaging with academic scholarship through articles and monographs grows increasingly challenging for many academics. For those of us who have been able to remain in this profession at all, many of us complete lengthy and frequent commutes, while others struggle to balance domestic labor with academic appointments that have only increased service and teaching loads in recent decades without increasing compensation to match these ballooning workloads. Without the incentives and resources that previously undergirded both knowledge production and consumption, many of us grow overwhelmed and arrive at the need to define for ourselves what role scholarship will occupy in our lives in light of our present circumstances. A podcast cannot address the root causes of these issues, but it can help build community and ameliorate some of the grief associated with widespread exclusion from the intellectual exercises that initially attracted many of us to the field of 19th century American studies.
Many good partners. Producing a podcast episode is not the equivalent to authoring a peer-reviewed publication. Should it be? It seems significant that the podcast form is poised to reach a far larger audience than traditional scholarly publication alone. According to the MLA Directory of Periodicals, J19, the official publication of C19, currently has 500 subscribers, and we can say with some confidence that every one of those subscribers probably doesn't read each issue cover to cover. Around 450 people are registered to attend the C19 conference in Pasadena, California next month, and concurrent panels mean that no one presenter can expect that large of an audience, even for keynote addresses. Most of our episodes reach at least 800 listeners by the year mark, with some episodes receiving thousands of streams. Some have been picked up by media sources and circulated far beyond the confines of our little professional organization. For each episode, we provide a full transcript which enables individuals with auditory processing issues to access our content and allow listeners to locate quotations, names of texts or scholars, or other details from the episode as needed. Finally, our podcast is peer-reviewed by our subcommittee, a team of experts who review and provide feedback on all proposals we receive. So perhaps it is time to expand institutional definitions of what counts as scholarly activity. While the C19 podcast is produced and largely consumed by scholars working in academic institutions, our most popular episodes are typically those that resonate with larger cultural concerns. The two most streamed episodes attest to the ongoing relevance of 19th century issues in the present moment, both inside and outside of academia. Our most popular episode, Aretha Mitchell's The N-Word in the Classroom, Just Say No, provides a thoughtful and informed response to the debate surrounding the vocalizing of racist slurs in the classroom, arguing that, quote, students and faculty members should not be subjected to hate speech in the classroom just because it appears in the text of the study, end quote. This episode has been cited in numerous books, and a quick Google search reveals links and references to the episode on syllabi and university resource pages from the University of Virginia, Ohio State University, the University of Washington, the University of Oregon, California State University, Fullerton, and elsewhere. Our second most streamed episode, Adam Fales and Jordan Stein's Wives and Their Authors, Elizabeth and Herman Melville, Literary Labor and Women's Work, explores the role of Herman Melville's wife Elizabeth in the production of Melville's fiction. On one hand, this episode examines the ways in which the field of Melville studies, in particular, has ignored Elizabeth Melville's labor, preferring instead to cultivate the myth of Melville as a solitary male genius. However, the episode is also a meditation on the long history of women's unacknowledged and undercompensated labor more generally, a narrative that non-specialists can easily follow and appreciate. While these episodes both explore specific academic contexts, they use these contexts to engage with broader social questions and issues of interest to the general public. The principles underwriting effective podcast episodes are thus virtually identical to the principles that we seek to employ in our classes to render difficult concepts legible to students. First, it is important to clearly and quickly communicate the stakes of an episode. Whether your subject is a canonical author or an obscure figure, listeners will need some explicit connection to something they know and can recognize the value of in order to identify how this information fits into what they already know. A number of episodes do this by invoking current events or contemporary debates, lending historical context for topics relevant to the present. Second, like articles, successful episodes begin with a roadmap of the text structure and signpost their progress and location throughout to orient the reader within the broader shape of the episode. Something as simple as a brief sound effect or musical interlude can signal a transition from one segment to the next, helping the listener order and process its structure and, consequently, its message. Third, information should be presented in short, concise units. Sentences should be simple and direct. Paragraphs should be focused. Sections should be clear and logically ordered. When relevant, communicating a message as a dialogue between two or more interlocutors can hold an audience's attention more effectively than a single voice reading long, ambling, or complex paragraphs. When when 2 or more contributors are creating an episode, we encourage them to meet over Zoom and record their respective audio components together so that their conversation will flow more naturally when they can see and riff off of one another in real time. We began this talk with Berkowitz and Gibson's assertion that the public humanities are about relationships across time, with ourselves, with one another, with our built and natural environments. Academic podcasts have the ability to ameliorate some of the difficulties introduced by the manufactured austerity plaguing institutions of higher education. These podcasts attest to an ongoing demand for scholarship outside of the academy. Even a subject as seemingly esoteric as the study of 19th century America can be packaged in a way that is broadly legible and individually and culturally valuable. People seek out podcasts primarily for entertainment. Teasing out connections between the present and the past in the podcast medium broadens the scope of academic scholarship and illustrates how many of the lessons of the past can find new lives and resonances in our current media landscape.
Thank you.
Thank you all for these very exciting papers. It's such a thrill to be here. There's some very uncanny overlaps, I think, between our papers, so I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. I forgot my name tag. I'm Sally. Okay. So I'll be speaking today about NourbeSe Phillips' 2008 poetry collection, Zong. And it's an amazing work, actually, to think through as a knowledge technology and as a critique of knowledge technologies like language and law. Zong is Phillips' anti-lyric, anti-logical, anti-legal, and practically anti-linguistic textual seascape. In its visual cuts and ripples, spoken slurs and stammers, Zong sounds out the ongoing cacophony that Christina Sharp calls the wake of transatlantic slavery. Throughout the collection, Philip attempts to untell the story that cannot be told of the 1871 massacre of 150 Africans or more, thrown overboard the slave ship Zong. And before I go any further, Philip's whole poetic craft is a refusal to make sense of this insane violence, and she explicitly describes Zong as a ritual invocation of the killed captives and as oracular messages spoken to her by her ancestor Sete Adamu Boteng. Sometimes her readings of these poems are, in fact, full ritual events with bells and candles. Sometimes she places phones on the floor. Sometimes there are dancers and musicians in the room. All this to say, the knowledge technology of a conference paper can access just a sliver of the poem's motion in and beyond the space of its performance. Philip has many mantras, one of them, defend the dead. But what does it mean to defend those who are beyond the reach of memory, their bones lost in the ocean? Words contain summoning magic for Philip, but in their nonsense, their palpable sounds, their emptiness, as much or more than in their semantic meanings. While the dead can be invoked in speech for Philip, they're already present in the silences, whether or not we light candles in a room like this one. So whatever is surfaced in speaking about Zong, in other words, is already true. That is, the nonsense of our physical presences here, infiltrated in ways that we don't and can't understand. So I want to talk briefly about the semantic and psychosomatic splits that condition embodied knowing as unknowing. By unwriting the brutal logics that naturalize mass murder, Philip sinks her hands into the gory nothingness embedded in language, in the hold of the slave ship, and in courts of English law. As she shows, each of these technologies becomes a vehicle for whiteness as rapacious consumption, a sexual economy in which Black bodies are instrumentalized, that is, made into technologies for labor and reproduction. But as instruments, Philip insists, the dead sing incomprehensibly the story that cannot be told. So I'll be thinking about Zong as what Fred Moten calls a fantasy in the hold, the zero zone where blackness and nothingness collide in unmade and unmaking sound. This is why Christina Sharp calls trans, asterisk, Atlantic blackness, what Philip calls her fugal compositional technique, in which she weaves psychosomatic splitting and psychic flight, and the psychic flight of racializing inscriptions into its palpable nonsense, surfacing something, in fact, of overwritten bodies. For a little more context on the events of the Zong massacre, in 1781, the slave ship Zong left the coast of Africa headed for Jamaica. But due to a navigational error, the trip that should have lasted 7 or so weeks ended up lasting 4 months. The captain eventually ordered that at least 150 Africans be thrown overboard, believing that cargo lost to perils of the sea rather than by natural deaths, they're all kind of written into English maritime law, that these losses or deaths could be compensated by insurance. When the ship returned to Liverpool, the insurers refused to pay and the ship owners sued, and the text of the resulting case, Gregson versus Gilbert, is the only documentary testimony of the massacre. So English maritime law, in other words, created and naturalized its own magic trick in which humans are transformed into insurable property. For Philip, English language and law, order and reason are driven insane by the gaping silences of the bodies they've consumed. They're deranged by the bodiness of Black bodies. The dissociation of science and referent, in other words, isn't a neutral difference for Philip. Historically, that dissociation is the necessary precondition of racializing abjection. Philip puts it this way. I deeply distrust this tool I work with, language. It is a distrust rooted in certain historical events that are all of a piece with the events that took place on the Zong. The language in which those events took place promulgated the non-being of African peoples, and I distrust its order, which hides disorder, its logic hiding the illogic, and its rationality, which is simultaneously irrational. She continues, within the boundaries established by words and their meanings, there are silences. Within each silence is the poem, which is revealed only when the text is fragmented and mutilated, mirroring the fragmentation and mutilation that slavery perpetrated on Africans, their customs and ways of life, end quote. Philip composes her poem using only the words of the Gregson versus Gilbert case, first simply excerpting them and rearranging them on the page. But she eventually dissects and reconfigures letters and syllables in what she describes as a violent sorceress attack, a bloody sacrifice of language in search of the bodies who are excised from it. She's describing her process here. I wipe out and black out words. Is there a difference? I mutilate the text as the fabric of African lives and the lives of these men, women, and children were mutilated. I murder the text, literally cut it into pieces, castrating verbs, suffocating adjectives, murdering nouns, throwing particles, prepositions, and conjunctions overboard, jettisoning adverbs. I separate subject from verb, verb from object, create semantic mayhem until my hands bloodied from so much killing and cutting reach into the stinking, eviscerated innards, and like some seer or sangoma or prophet who, having sacrificed an animal for signs and portents of a new life, or simply life, reads the untold story that tells itself by not telling. So in her writing, Philip is entering a semantic scene of violent dismemberment, linguistically performing the racializing and ungendering inscription that Hortense Spillers describes as hieroglyphics of the flesh. We'll get there in a second. So these hieroglyphics or physical wounds expose the 0 degree of social conceptualization onto which gender, sexuality, and Blackness are written as fungible in the name of property. This forced fungibility of meaning organizes or disorganizes Zong 18. I will try to fix that after. Means truth, means overboard, means sufficient, means support, means foul, means rebuts, means necessity, means provision, means perils, means evidence, means mortality, means policy, means voyage, means market, means slaves, means more, means dead, means want. Water means water. The poem begins with an act of interpretation, but there's nothing to interpret. The initial lacuna doesn't even register as a lacuna until the orphan for means appears. Whatever follows in the poem, whatever will be explained, can only drift above this silence. The silence is both the violence concealed under the logical order and the bones that don't exist. They can't be exhumed, or as Phil kind of embeds this word exoquat, lifted up from the bottom of the ocean. That next word, truth, drives home the point even more sharply. What means truth? Truth has to be defined by what follows it. The body's thrown overboard. This loss adds up to sufficient for the ship owners and that captain acting in their stead. Everything supposedly means everything else. Words are made into exchangeable, substitutable entities as the bodies that enter the circulation of capital. But even so, the math of this poem doesn't add up. As we move down the stack, a faint narrative emerges. Policy means voyage, means market, means slaves, means more, means dead. In the excess sense of these forced equivalences, more means dead. The accumulation of wealth means the consumption of black bodies. In her book In the Wake, Christina Sharp develops the term trans-asterisk Atlantic. Actually, clap when the asterisk comes up because it won't always be on the slide. Transatlantic, to describe this effect. The excess sense seeping from brutal transformations enforced on black bodies. I'll abbreviate her words, but the whole quote. I want to think trans in a variety of ways that try to get at something about or toward the range of transformations enacted on and by black bodies. The asterisk after a word functions as the wild card. Actually, I'm going to keep reading because it's so good. And I am thinking the trans in that way, as a means to mark the ways that slave and the black occupy what C.D.A. Hartman calls the position of the unthought. The asterisk after the prefix trans holds the place open for thinking from and into that position. It speaks as well to a range of embodied experiences called gender, and to Europe Western gender's dismantling, its inability to hold in or on black flesh. The asterisk speaks to a range of configurations of black being that take the form of translation, transatlantic, transgression, transgender, transformation, transmogrification, transcontinental, transfixed, transmediterranean, transubstantiation, by which process we might understand the making of bodies into flesh and then into fungible commodities, while retaining the appearance of flesh and blood, transmigration, and more. She sums this up so effectively. We might say that slavery trans all desire, as it made some people into things, some into buyers, sellers, owners, fuckers, and breeders of that black flesh. That excess is here writ large on black bodies, as it is with the process of subjection. It's amazing kind of summary of that. So to be transformable in this way is to have one's life constantly asterisked, accompanied and split always by risk. Zong 18 shows the perils of this substitutability, but also the excess sense generated from apparent emptiness. The opening lines of the poem signal both what can't be spoken and the impossible event of speech emerging from apparent silence. And the end of the poem, meanwhile, want water means water, suggests the finality of drowning, but also the actual material existence of something, even if that existence is only known by its absence. The transformations performed in this poem ride both the energy of violence and the irreducible materiality of language, which manages, despite itself, to mean. Blackness, Philip suggests, is precisely this transforming, fugitive meaning of the physical. While Philip excerpts and rearranges words from the case in the first section of the book, the texture of the poem shifts as she starts splitting words from themselves and recombining them into new voices, and a more kind of specifically ungendering violence begins to emerge. Strangely, later on in the collection, the most consistent voice that starts to consolidate seems to be that of a European crewmate on board the ship. So amidst the polyphonic fugal weave in these pages, the crewmate's fantasy of an Edenic garden unfolds, filled with Africans transfigured into animals ripe for consumption. So let's see. We're not gonna do this. Also, cheers to the woman at the hotel who gave me a pencil to have in research. That's mine. That's not in there. She was like, yes, you can have this. Okay. You can try to track along if you want to, but again, and you can read this in kind of whatever order, but I'm gonna make one up. So let's see. Over and over again, this creed of greed is new. It feeds the lust for tin, for gold, comes to rest my pet, my she Negro. How do we parse the deed? Is it one or many? How do we praise the dead? A job well done, the captain says. The pain, le pen, ant, ain't it do. I have your ear eye, rave eye, rev, je rev, me rev, le rev, in the den of our garden, you and I, Ruth, will have stags, boars, and deer. Harp in the river, doves, there will be dogs, fish, and grouse, owls, and tits, the hens, to know, pigs he, Negroes, and she, Negroes, J, Rev, Payne has a lease on this, Rev, erase, this erase, me ave. So here also, I'm sorry if anyone in here speaks French. Sorry. Here, the oracular voice naming the creed of greed, in which words are simply instruments for satiating European hunger, or the voice names that. That naming slides indistinguishably into the sailor's claim to ownership of the animalized pet of the she Negro. Midway down the page, the sailor breaks into a hallucination of him and Ruth, who typically stands in for a captive African, but sometimes also seems to be a European white figure. It's like very clear. Stags and boars, deer, carp and river doves, and of course, he Negroes and she Negroes are plentiful in the Eden of our garden. But with the mention of she Negroes, the narration cracks into French, je rêve, or I dream. The hallucination, perhaps in a confessional contortion of the same voice, perhaps as an interruption, that's a little unclear. The sentence, pain has a lease on my dreams, I think like consolidates something really important. The cost of the lease, this lease on my dreams, we might imagine, is £30 sterling, which Philip talks about in the final essay as the price of each captive. And here, just like one of the little details that's like everywhere, there's so many kind of amazing details in this text. Philip is probably playing from a distance on the irony that the crew doesn't catch in their own religion, that Jesus was traded for 30 pieces of silver. So in this transatlantic fantasy, the abundance of Eden is paid for in African lives. And the plea to erase this and erase me is the self-annihilating pressure that is the underside of these deadly fancies. In this weave of strained, cracking themes, Philip recognizes what she calls the counterpointed fugal narrative of Zong. This blew my mind. So fugue, I did not know this. This is incredible. A fugue is like, more commonly known as a polyphonic composition constructed of one or more short subjects or themes, which are harmonized according to the laws of counterpoint and introduced from time to time with various contrapuntal devices. But in psychiatry, a fugue also describes a flight from one's own identity, often involving travel to some unconsciously desired locality. It's like the perfect word. That's incredible. So self-abandonment, in other words, is the price of murder in its imagined garden. The amnesiac denialism of the captain and crew of White Capital writ large fissures sense. Near the top of the passage, the oracular voice asks, how do we parse the deed? Is it one or many? How do we praise the dead? Every single death is itself uncountable. Was the massacre one or many events? Amidst these deeds that cannot be parsed, Philip presents the dreamscape in which subjectivities are unbound from themselves in a collective abandonment. And at the same time, she suggests that a song emerges even in the midst of that. Zong's song, it's deliberate, is an ongoing life in the wake of enslavement, a life in what Fred Moten calls the burial ground of the subject. An exhausted improvisatory embodiment can, in its burial ground, take flight beyond sense. Along with Frank Wilderson, Moten urges that the hold of the slave ship is the starting point of embodied unknowing, where human instruments can unmake themselves in some never-before-heard song. There are flights of fantasy in the hold of the ship, the ordinary fugue and fugitive run of the language lab, Black phonography's brutally experimental venue. Para-ontological totality is still in the making. Present and unmade in presence, Blackness is an instrument in the making. Quasi una fantasia, in its paralegal swerve, its mad-worked braid, the imagination produces nothing but accents in the hold. And so it is that we remain in the hold, in the break, as if entering again and again the broken world, to trace the visionary company and join it. In Philip's mad-worked braid, the ordinary fugue and fugitive run of her language style, this leads again and again to the broken world. As a knowledge technology, Zong insists on its own brokenness and inefficacy. Still, Philip is willing to be contaminated by her broken instruments. This is the physical price of affiliation, digging one's hands into a history that stains and unravels one's own body.